Hello my friends and welcome to our third Penpot Hands-on session. I hope you are prepared. I'm really excited about this one today, like really genuinely actually excited about it, because today we are talking about flex and grid layout. Now, if you are completely new and you don't know what I'm talking about, don't you worry, I will get you introduced nice and gently. In this session, we're going to introduce you to these concepts, and maybe later on down the line, we'll do a few more sessions to really jump in deep, but this should give you a good idea of what on earth is flex and grid layout and how to get started. Please do ask questions. We will have some Q&A throughout, so if you have any questions relevant to the things that I'm talking about, then just pop a little message in the comments on the platform that you're on and we can pick those up and I can answer those for you. And we will have one big Q&A at the very end so that I can try and answer all of your questions that I can manage, and hopefully maybe even show you how to do things live, because I like to do things chaotically here. And hi friends, everyone who's appearing in the comments, it's really nice to see you. Got some old friends and some new friends in here, I can see. This is really nice. And first of all, I just want to cover what is Penpot. Why are we here? Well, Penpot is a fantastic design tool. It is free and open source. You can use it with unlimited designers and developers, unlimited files, unlimited drafts. And one of the features that I am most excited about is flex and grid layouts. I think it's something that really sets Penpot apart and really helps you do UI design in an incredibly modern way. So maybe we will get into what are flex and grid layouts first. So here I have a little app design that I've made. Now, this is just a basic little screen for what would be an audiobook app. So it's got a little player at the bottom here. We've got some books that you can read, a list of genres, we've got a menu, got a search bar. This is all quite typical for an app UI. And I've created this in Penpot here. And maybe I'm just going to jump in here, and one of the things I can do, I'm going to choose my little genre list here. This is using flex layout. Now, maybe I actually want all of the buttons to make the most of the space that's available to it and fill up all of this space. So I'm going to set that to fill the space like this. So you see it's nicely aligned and we've really maximized the space. It's kind of giving this bento box layout situation. So what I can do now is if I select my board, I'm going to go to inspect mode. And if you're a person familiar with code, you don't have to be, don't you worry. This has all of the code currently viewing for this board, the relevant CSS properties in here. But what we can also do is go to the code view. Now here we have some HTML and some CSS, and I'm just going to jump into another tab. I want to go to code pen, and I'm going to create a new pen, and this is just allowing me to paste in my HTML and CSS, and I'm going to save that. It's going to complain at me because it likes to complain that my files are too big. And now we can see this is how our design actually looks in code. And if I drag the browser like this, you can see how elements of my design, although it's a bit funky right now, but how they flex and flow to fit the screen. So this is responsive design. Now, responsive design is a design that adapts to the user's environment. So if you think about the websites and apps you use today, I'm going to jump to the Penpot website. So this is a classic responsive design where you can see everything really lovely and laid out well on this very big screen that I've got right now. If I resize my screen, slowly you'll see, oh, the design is adapting to fit the screen. So this is how it might look on, say, a tablet size. If you're on a mobile, it would look more like this. And you can see how all of these different elements on the page flex and flow and refit depending on the size of the device. We also then have different kinds of sites, so this is a fabric website. I love me some fabric. And this has much more conventional sort of grid layout for all of the products here. And when I resize, oh, those change layout as well. And maybe it's a more art directed style site. And again, these even, they can choose to have a big menu that's spaced out, or then it condensed into a much smaller menu. Go very small, no browser's that small, so you can break it. But this is as it gets wider again. The reason why we want to do responsive design is because creating a different design that fits every single device is practically impossible. I mean, you'd have to know all the devices out there, you'd have to know the orientation that someone's using their device, whether it's in portrait or whether it's in landscape. It's really impossible to do. And so responsive design came about as a way of adapting your design to fit the viewport without having those strict different sizes. I mean, you could design a separate design for desktop and for iPad and for mobile, but for what are all those cases in between? What about these really big phones that are almost the size of a tablet? What about laptops versus desktop? They're quite different experiences. So designing responsively gives us a way of adapting for all of these different shapes. And we could think about things like maybe menus, that when you go very narrow, they collapse behind a menu button. We can think about these grids that reflow. We can think about navigation that drops onto two lines. All of these are different components that we can consider how individually we want to design those responsively. Now this can seem really complex at first. It's kind of a whole other way of looking at design. Rather than looking at design as being static individual screens, or as I like to say, pictures of websites or apps, we're considering rules that we give to the browser or to the app framework or whatever we're using to tell it how to adapt when it reaches particular points. So how do we design for this level of complexity? With Flex and Grid. These are such valuable layout tools that will help us be able to work out where things should flex, where things should flow, what order things should flow into. So, Flex Layout is really the most powerful layout that we have available to us. And I'm going to show you this board here. So this one here is Flex, and this one here is Grid. This has got a Flex layout on it, this one has got a Grid layout on it. Now, as you can see, as I change the width of my board, they reflow and flex ever so slightly differently. Now, Flex I absolutely love because it gives you a way to lay out content in one direction. And that direction can either be side to side, so you can go one direction, you can go backwards, you can go down, you can go up, and you can choose whether the content, as you change the size of its container, will wrap or not. So I've just turned off the wrap setting, and so now if I change the side of the board, you see my objects don't fall to another line. They stay on their one row. And if I select it and turn on wrap again, now if I change the size of the container, you see that it wraps onto the next line. So they'll keep doing that. This is really great because you can fill up all of the space that's available to you and choose an orientation that works well for the content inside it. And it can also really easily accommodate as many or as few items as you want to put inside your container. So for example, if I do that and then I decide, oh, I'm going to hide this letter F. You see, everything just reflows to fit the content that it has. So I can show that again. I could add another L and it all reflows, but look how it's still got lovely even gaps between, aligned centrally as well. Get rid of that L again to get back. I'll tell you a little bit later about how we actually work on creating these layouts. This is just me giving you an idea, dipping your toes in. You can align your Flex elements any direction that you want. So this is your container, and these FLEX are your elements inside your container. Now you can affect their alignment using the buttons here. So I could say I align them to the top or the middle or the bottom. Because this container fits the height of the letters, it's not going to make a huge amount of difference. But however, if I made it, it's going to resize, so that's not right. If I flow it the other direction, now you can see I can choose left, right, center, like that. If I go back to my original direction, I can also choose whether they all align to one side or the other, or to the middle, or there's space in between them, or there's space evenly around them, or they are spread evenly in the middle. I can also choose how the items fit inside it, so I can align the contents to the space evenly, space around, space between, end, center, or start. I find sometimes that the names can be quite confusing, and really the icons tell you everything that you need to know here. I'm going to pop that back into the middle. You can also arrange the spacing around your flex layout in a couple of different ways. So you can do padding, which is the space around your elements. So you can see here that it's highlighted when I select it. So maybe I want that to be 30 and I want this to be 60. So that's quite a big amount of space. And so that's the padding, and also the space in between the elements, which is referred to as the gap. And so I could make the space between a lot bigger. Of course, the first one didn't have any impact because I've only got one row, but if I narrow it, now you can see I put 60. Oh, I've got the wrong thing selected. There we go. 60. It will put that amount of space in between there. Put it back to normal. There we go. You can also decide whether the items inside of the layout itself, whether it's going to fill the entire width of the container that it itself is in, whether it fits the contents of the container, so then it will just fit exactly the size of the blocks inside it, or whether you want a fixed width where you can drag and change the width and it will stay like that. But I like full width, make maximum flexibility. And you can do the same for the height. You can choose to have a fixed height, to go full height, or to fit the height of the contents as well. And these combined can give really unique ways of choosing how you flex and flow to fit the available layout. So you can, as I've done here, I've set it to be full width, but I've set it to fit the height of the contents. So that means that when I resize the container, that dark purple box is always the full width of the container, but the height always just matches the contents of what's in it. So next up, grid. Now this is a bit of a funky layout that I've done here, but I think it's a fun example. Grid is slightly different from Flex in that it gives you the option to lay out in two directions at once. So you're going horizontal and vertically, and you're planning the content for both. If I go to edit the grid layout here, this can give you a bit of an idea of where the grid actually is. So I have 3 columns and 3 rows. You can see that at the start of each column, it says 1 and it goes to 2. That's the first column, which is 1 FR wide. I will come back to that in a moment. There is a second column, which goes 2 to 3, and a third column, 3 to 4. And the same with the rows down the side here. Now 1 FR is a fantastic unit. It might be new to you. And what an FR is a fraction. So what it's saying is use 1 fraction of the available space. So having 3 columns that are 1 FR wide means that the content, each column will be a third of the available space. You can get quite complicated by starting to do 2 FRs, 4 FRs, as many FRs as you want. And that can create quite a complicated layout, but for now, this works for me. The reason it works for me is that I can also have grid cells that span multiple columns and multiple rows. So this is how you can create this kind of an effect. So this grid cell here, I've set it to manual, And what that allows me to do, rather than saying automatically fill the columns and the rows according to their sizes, it's saying, okay, set this grid cell to have a manual positioning, and it's going to start at 1 and then go to 2. That's the column. And then the rows start at 1 but then go to 3. And so it's spanning 1 to 3 and 1 to 2. For this one, this second cell, we're going the other way around. And so in the columns, we're spanning 2 columns, we're spanning 2 to 4, and we're spanning 1 row, we're spanning 1 to 2. So you can imagine with this level of control, you can do all kinds of very complex layouts. And much like Grid, you have these similar settings. You can choose that the content fills your grid based on rows or based on columns. Because I've got manual positioning here, this won't actually have any effect right now. But what it will do is if you have a bunch of separate items, it will either flow them starting top to bottom and going back to the top to the bottom or the other direction. You can also align things centrally or to the left and the right, and you can also align its contents in this way as well. One of the very cool features of Grid, which I'm using here, is that you can tell the items inside your grid to stretch to fill those grid cells. This is a really useful property to have if you really want to maximize the grid look. Maybe you're making a bento box with some cards in it and you want to be people to be able to see this grid layout. That's the kind of feature you want to do for that. And that means that when we resize our board, these grid letters keep filling all of that available space. Just checking that I have covered everything that I want to do for this section. Not quite, because I wanted to talk to you briefly about the benefits of using Grid and Flex. So those of you who've got good imaginations will probably already be able to see how this works and think, okay, maybe I can use it for this component, maybe I can use it for my navigation, maybe I can use it for this card that I've got in mind, maybe I can use it for the whole page layout, but I will show you some cool examples in a minute. And between Flex and Grid, you can combine the two of them together to create really complex layouts that will flex and flow to adapt to the screen, like in those examples that we saw before. And probably the best thing about Flex and Grid layout is that it is using exactly the same terminology and code as you use on the web. So this is the killer feature. You know that I showed you before that when you go to inspect mode and it shows you, that's very wide, it shows you these CSS properties. Flex and Grid are concepts in CSS code. What that means is that when you're working, whether you're a designer or a developer, when this goes into development, your design, as you've designed it in Penpot, will look exactly the same on the web. No more interpretation, no more handoff. It will just work as you designed it to. And I think that's kind of mind-blowing personally. So, dare I ask, after going through all of that, whether anyone has any questions yet, bearing in mind I will be telling you more detail in how to create Flex and Grid layouts a little bit later on. But if you have any questions, you can ask in the comments. Most of the platforms that you're watching this on, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's on LinkedIn, we'll be able to pick those questions up and you can ask me here in the chat. So I'm just having a little look through and see, do we have any questions yet? And if not, you can save them to the end. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of good questions for me at the end. Great. So next I'm going to move on to tell you about using Flex and Grid for auto layout in Penpot. So let's go to a new page. And here's some I made earlier. We'll just get rid of those, shall we? And this board is a little bit bright, so I'm just going to use a different colour for that. That's better. I tried to stick with dark mode. I thought it felt more soothing if we had lots of dark mode going on. So there's many different ways you can do layout in Penpot. I'm just going to grab a little component from here. We saw them before. There we go. We wanted one of these ones. Okay. So first off, this is the board. Now boards are really important because they can act as your containers, but we want everything to have a board in Penpot so that we have a space for it to render inside and we know how it relates to, you could treat it like a background, so how it relates to its background. You need a background if you're going to have a layout. And you can choose an artboard from here. You can choose a preset size if you have something specific in mind, or you can just draw a random size out like I have here. 531 by 408 pixels, which is really not very even. I like to use even numbers where I can. It makes me feel organised and soothed. And that brings me to one of the ways you can do layouts. And if you've used design tools before, you'll be familiar with this. You can just drag items around on the canvas. Here Penpot's giving me a little bit of guidance on some alignment points I might want to use. So that's one easy way to do a layout. Just drag stuff into place. If you wanted to be precise about it, I suppose you could choose the X and Y values of where you want your item to appear. So you could go, oh, I want that to be 100 pixels from the left of my board and 100 pixels from the top of my board. So you can be more precise in that way too. If you have another object as well, you might want to align those objects to each other. So because Penpot helps me snap things into alignment, you can do that by dragging things around. You can select both of your items and you can choose to align them using the alignment tools up here. So this is in the design panel. I can say align top. I can align them centrally to each other. So I can do, if I have another one, maybe I want to ensure that they are spaced evenly. So these are things that you can do with alignment. It's all very manual. This is exactly how I used to design. This is what I've been doing with design tools for years and years and years. You can do this all manually if you want. You could group elements. So I'm just going to select group. I right click and select group, and this will help you reposition them together. That's very helpful as well. But Flex and Grid is kind of like super powered layout. So for example, I might have, I'm going to put another E in here, just duplicate that one. Okay, so I've got a bunch of not very well aligned items in here. I'm going to select all of them together. They're in a group already. And I'm going to my design panel here, and I'm going to choose Flex Layout. Now you see that they've jumped. That's because Penpot tries to be quite clever and helps you with your layout. That if you've already laid your elements out in a particular way that can be adapted to Flex, it will do that, which is quite a useful way to get started. So I've got a Flex layout here. Automatically, it's going to flow according to the order of my layers in this in the layers panel here. And so it's hard to tell because I've got a couple that are the same. But you see I've got the purples and then the pinks. And because my layout is flowing from right to left, the purples go like that, and then the pinks follow afterwards. It's also based on the spacing that's between my elements already, has guessed at a reasonable spacing. You know me, I like round numbers, so I'm going to make that 30. But once you've chucked your elements in there and added a layout, it's quite easy to make your tweaks from there. And you can do the same thing with Grid. I'm going to name this one Flex. Later on, I will make this file available to you. If you go to the Penpot community, I'll upload it there as soon as the stream is finished. So this is why I'm renaming things so that you can come back and remember what I was doing later on. So I'm going to duplicate this board and I'm going to call this one Grid, and I'll just call this Grid as well. It's not Grid. Now what you could do is you can just, once you've created a layout, so this has still got its Flex layout, despite the fact I've relabeled it Grid, quite confusing. You can use this delete button and that will remove the layout. Your items will still remain in the position you put them in. So you could just use it as a tool for alignment, but you'd be missing out on all of the features that it offers if you did that. And maybe I'm going to add a couple more E's. Why are there so many E's, you ask? This is because I wanted to help drill this into your brain that the items inside of a flex and grid layout are called elements. So when there is an item inside a grid layout, it is a grid element. When there is an item inside a flex layout, it is a flex element. So I just thought E for elements, not elephants. Right, so I've just chucked all of these elements into this board that is called grid, very confusingly, and I'm going to add a layout to it, and I'm going to choose grid layout. And there we go, it has jumped. It knows that I have 6 items in there, so it has quite cleverly given us a nice 3-column, 2-row grid. Now I could change this around a bit if I wanted. I could add another row, and then maybe I delete a row and it will reorder it like that. I can delete elements inside my grid too. And let's make this a bit more even. So I've got a row gap of 30, and I like to have it consistent, and a column gap of 30. Maybe you can't really tell, but I can put 20 padding around that as well. You can also, if you want to use different padding on each side, you can open up the multiple padding option there. And so what I said before about being able to remove the layout once you have aligned it, the reason you don't want to do that is because keeping the layout is really useful. Because now that I have this as a grid layout, what I could do is I can go back to my components and I can drag another element out, and I can drag it in and pop it straight into my grid layout. Now if I go back to view this again, these have got quite similar names, so you might have to look carefully. Now that I've dragged that element into the cell, I can reorder the elements in the cell very easily by the one that I've got selected. I'm using the arrow keys on my keyboard and I'm going left, so I moved it left, up, I've moved it up, up, and so you can very easily reorder the grid cells like this. Or it's not reordering the grid cells, it's reordering the content which is in each grid cell, if I'm going to be precise about it. And this flex and grid, as I said before, is super powered, oh, resize that by accident, because you are getting this real CSS out of it that can be used for development. So it is genuinely really good. And because it is inherently flexible. And so this takes us to our next section, which is creating responsive designs using flex and grid. Next section now. There we go. The gremlins have gotten out of the system. So I'm going to return back to my app page here. Now, flexible layouts are necessary for the responsive design that I showed you earlier. You know that I was talking about whether you want to order your content into grid, whether you want your navigation to flow onto 2 rows and things like that. And so you need that flexibility. It's not just about aligning things in a layout, but it is about designing that flexibility into your layouts. And you can use fixed heights and widths as much as you like, but the power really comes from letting go of a little bit of that control and letting things fill the width or fit the content as much as you can. So let's look, for example, at this little discover. So this is a title that I've got inside of my app. Now you can tell in the layers panel, the flex layouts are represented by these little 2 blocks. And if they are going top to bottom, they will look like 2 columns like this, column layout. And if they're going in row layout, they will have the 2 blocks being horizontal. And if you're using a grid layout, it has 4 little boxes like that. So this title and icon is a flex layout. one of the reasons you'd want to use a flex layout for this is maybe on some pages you have this title but you don't have an icon. If I hide the icon, the text just reflows so that it is aligned correctly with the rest of the layout. I've also set these so that they are center aligned, which means that that's centered horizontally, vertically. I muddle up horizontal and vertical sometimes. Aligned to the middle, now you know what I mean. So that means that no matter the size of your icon or the size of your text, they will always be beautifully aligned to that central point. And let's look at another one. This is the classic one, a little input. And so inside our input, we have an icon again, which I can show and I can hide. I probably want a bit more padding on that so that when it's hidden, it doesn't make the box really small. So that's something I could change. And if I hid the placeholder text, the space is still there. It's still the width that we want it to be. It's still full width in its available area, but everything is still aligned really nicely. I showed you earlier that we can align these items, spread them across the available space, or maybe I just want to align them to the top. Maybe I want to align them to the bottom or to the center. Maybe space it evenly. I quite like that one. I quite like it so that it's aligned to the top and the bottom, because that feels like it. See how nicely that aligns to the top of that bar there and the bottom, well, not quite to the bottom of that bar there, but close enough. So I think that that looks more aesthetically pleasing. For something like a little player, like these controls here, you want to have these evenly spaced in the center. And so that's what I've got in here. I'm using flex for this. And so they are spaced in, aligned so that they're in the vertical and they're actually currently left aligned, but they've got a gap of 20 between them so we can keep that lovely even spacing as well. So have I got you enough into the idea that you really want to build some flex and grid layouts? We are going to get to that in 1 second. You know what I'm going to ask you next. Do you have any questions? If you have questions, you can go to the comments section on all of the various platforms, and we have a question, yay! Okay, Michael asks, hi Michael, I believe the code generated fully validates to W3 standards. Yes, it does. It does validate to W3C standards. So hold on to your hats, nerds. I'm going to jump into the code very quickly. And so granted, if you're a developer, you'll probably want to make your HTML a little more semantic, but it will absolutely validate. Here, if I scroll through, this is a lot of the font faces and things like that. Important that the fonts render correctly. So for example, this is the board that I've got selected here. So this is the home board, and you can see this is all really nice grid CSS. See, the padding is the same. Maybe you want to change your pixels to a different unit. Maybe you want to make it M's to make it a bit more flexible. If you're a CSS nerd like me, you know what I mean. And you can see that these grid rows and the grid template columns, which is, if I give myself a little bit more space. So I've actually got a grid on the whole of this page here. And I have named grid areas, which is another thing you can do, which I might go into in a later session. But I've got a sidebar and a main. These are actually an overall page grid layout that I've got going on here. And so that's what you were seeing the code for in there. I hope that that answers the question, Michael. But if anyone else has any more questions, do you have plugins that can export responsive Penpot designs directly to website builders like Oxygen, Webflow, Framer, and Wix Studio? Oh, now that's a cool idea. So right now, we don't have the plugins available today. However, very soon, and those of you in the community will know that Penpot will soon be releasing plugins and the ability for you to make your own plugins for Penpot. And so, hey, maybe if you're one of the folks from Wix or Framer or any of those other platforms, maybe you want to make it easy for people to export from Penpot to there. But otherwise, I mean, pretty much any developer working today will be able to work with certainly CSS and HTML. And so you should have a really easy time handing over to a developer if you are not already a developer yourself. Michael asks, fluid layouts without media queries. So I guess you're asking, can these be created as fluid layouts without media queries? So media queries in CSS is the idea that you have particular breakpoints in your design in which you choose to switch to a different layout, perhaps. And so you might say, when the width of the user's browser is somewhere between a mobile size and a tablet size, so you'd say like 320 pixels and 1200 pixels. When it's in that space, do this layout. And it's kind of going back to the idea of designing for quite specific widths. So if you can avoid using those breakpoints and just making your design fluid to fill any available space, that is our ideal with modern layouts. So this is what Michael's asking about. And this is exactly what Penpot is designed to do. There are no media queries in Penpot, and I think that's for the better. It's encouraging you to think outside of those very specific sizes and boxes. However, if you did want to work in a situation that you did have different breakpoints, what I would probably recommend is that you create a separate board for each breakpoint that you wanted. Create your fluid design within that. Maybe you want to use components so you can repeat the layout across different boards, and then you'll be able to talk to a developer, or if you're a developer yourself, use media queries at those specific board widths to be able to execute the design that you really wanted. Are we ready to move on to the next section? Do we have any more questions? Great. So, shall we get started with actually making stuff in Flex and Grid? How to use Flex Layout. Right, let us jump right in. This is where we're really getting into the hands-on of the hands-on. So, as I said before, the first thing that you want is a board. So I'm making my board. And being me, I will make it a very specific size. Doesn't really matter. And to save your eyes, I'm going to make that dark. So it's a bit easier on the eyes. Right, I'm going to recreate one of the cards for the audiobooks. I'm going to jump into my assets again. Here is where I've got my components in my local library. And I'm going to, right, that's my book title. I'm dragging that out. Author title. What else do I need? A button of some kind, a play button. And a book cover. I've actually got my book covers in a separate assets library. Maybe we'll talk about design systems some point soon. Let me know in the comments if you want to talk about design systems at later hands-on. I'm going to drag in a book cover. That's massive, but that'll do the job. Right. So I've gone back to my layers. So now you can see I've got this massive book cover. So I'm just going to resize that so we can see everything else. I have a play button. I have a author. I have a book title. I'm just going to, I like to keep my layers quite a tidy order, which is helpful for Flex and Grid Layout as well. But it just helps me visualize what I want to do and where I want to put things. Not strictly necessary, really. So I'm going to make this into a Flex layout. So first of all, I'm going to apply Flex to my board. I'm just going to call this a card, just so I have in my mind what it's going to be. I'm going to give it a border radius of 10, because I like a little border radius, and I'm going to add Flex layout. So you can see, as I explained before, it's going to automatically give me a rough layout based on the existing positioning of my elements. Now I want these to be center aligned, I reckon. I don't think I'll keep the center alignment for the text, but we'll get to that in one moment. Aligned from top to bottom. Probably don't want it to wrap. I'll align the content to the center as well. And then, you know me, I like to have some even spacing. Padding, 30 seems quite big. We'll do 20. You can't really tell when the board is this big. Maybe we'll make it a little bit smaller. Yeah, okay. So I've just got one flex layout going from top to bottom right now. This isn't really a great optimization of this space here. I think I want to have the text on one side and the button on the other. So I'm going to create another flex layout inside the first flex layout. I'm going to zoom in a bit. Hopefully you can see that nicely. So first I want to group these elements. I'm going to group the bottom section. And this is going to be a flex layout as well. So I'll add a flex layout there. And I'm going to call this meta. If in doubt, call it meta. And instead of going from top to bottom, I want to arrange this to go left to right. It's not perfect right now, but it will be, trust me. Now, I've actually got some space factored in to my card here. I've actually got this padding here. So I'm going to make this, it's currently fitting to the width of the contents, that's why they're all clustered like this. I'm going to make them fit the width of the card. You see these are overflowing a little bit, but we'll sort that out in a minute, and it's fitting the height of its contents. And I will make these aligned to the center and aligned to the center, no, aligned to the outside. And of course this text is really jumbled up here, so maybe I'm going to add another flex layout. I'm going to group these, and this will be text, and I'm going to flow it in the other direction. So I'm going to add another flex layout. I'm going to flow it from top to bottom and put a little bit of spacing. So I want a gap in here, maybe not as much as before. Yeah, that is quite nice. I want to align it to the left. I find that aesthetically pleasing. I'm going to set the width to 100%. So what that will do is we'll make that fill all of the available space, because maybe in the case of this card will have longer text in it, and I want to be able to accommodate that as much as possible and fit the height of its contents as well. And if I go back to this meta, I've just been aware that if that text is full width, it's going to jump, like bash up against the side of this button. So we want a bit more spacing in there. So I'm going to add some gap in between there of 10. Yeah, that'll probably be adequate. Yeah. I also want to set at the moment my cover is set to have a fixed height and a fixed width. So I'm going to make that 100% of the card size and the height. When you have multiple flex elements that are at 100%, what they'll do is they'll share the available space in there. And so there we have a flex layout. Next up, I'm going to actually skip questions because I've just checked the time and I don't want to overrun, and we've got to have time to get to grid. So I think we'll jump straight into grid, and if you have any questions later, I will answer them in the Q&A at the end. So let's go to how to use grid layout. Now I'm back on a fresh page, so I'm going to create another board, and this board I'm going to make dark again, and this is going to be our grid. Now I have, as I mentioned before, in my components, in my file library, I have a bunch of book cards that I made earlier. They're all components that are based off of the main component. So I've got all these different covers, different titles in here. So I'm just dragging them out. You can see the designer in me is automatically dragging them out to roughly even spacing and positioning. I can't help it. That's just how I'm built. So I'm going to start chucking them in like a mess like that. So you can see that from my layout, I've just got layers for each of these components here. Now I'm going to apply the grid to the main board. I'm going to add grid layout. Now this has automatically generated a grid layout for me. You see some of the stuff has run off the edge, so let's have a look at what the grid is doing right now. Now I think because of how I chucked it all on, it's given me 1 row and 9 columns. So it's a very wide grid right now, and that's why you can't see it's all overhanging the board. So let's change that up. We want to give more rows to fit the content in better. So I can't remember how many items I had in there, but I think that should do. And then I'll just remove some of these columns, and you can see it will automatically start reflowing into the available space. There we go. That looks a bit better. Now I'm going to resize my board just so I've got a bit more space for it. So now I have a very basic grid. Let me go back to this view so you can see the outline of the grid much better. Now I want to add some spacing between my grid rows and the same spacing between my grid columns and some padding around the outside. If you find yourself in this situation where the grid is kind of overhanging the outside of your board, what you want to do is you want to go to the board itself, and you see here my board has a fixed height and a fixed width. So no matter the size of the things that are inside it, it's going to stay at 893 pixels wide and 913 pixels tall. So I'm going to say fit to content instead. And what that will do is it will make my board always fit the grid content that's inside it. So it's a nice way of keeping it neat and tidy. Now this grid does not look bad already. There's not much I really need to do. Now part of that is down to the fact that each of the grid elements, so the layers that are inside the grid, they are set to fill the available space. The components are, yeah, so they can fit out like that. And so they're stretching to fit that. And so that is looking pretty neat and tidy. Is there anything else that I wanted to tell you about the grid? Oh yeah, I'm going to show you quickly how to span the, how to make them span an extra width and height. So I'm going to do some maths here. I'm just working out, I'm going to make that one span 4. So I'm going to add another row. Otherwise it will push some of my items off the grid. Now I'm going to select, go back to edit grid. I'm selecting this grid cell. Now remember that what I told you before. If I want this cell here to span 2 columns and 2 rows, I'm going to go from auto to manual positioning, and I want it to go from the first column line to the third column line. So I'm going to put 3 in there. And I want it to go from the first column line to the third column line. I'll do it like that. And you can see it's pushed the other items into the next row down. Now I can choose to align my element like this, so that it's a tiny little book in the middle of its space. Or if I hit done, I'm editing the grid, I'm going to go to the element itself, and I'm going to tell that to fill the available space. And we want the cover inside to fill the available space, and the image inside of that to fill the available space. Sometimes you have to make sure that it's going to interpret your rules correctly all the way down inside the layers. I want that the height of the contents. I will make that the width. And in this kind of case, you'd probably want to change the size of your text. So I'm going to just do that to a big title. And you can easily override your styles in that way in your components. So that is how we make a grid. Now, I quickly want to show you, if you want some more examples of grid and flex layouts, things like this but a bit simpler, you can go to the Penpot libraries and templates, and from there, if you scroll down, it's the one with the pink, the basic layouts template. This is a template I made a couple of months ago, and if you download that and import it into Penpot, like I have done here, you'll get a how to use page first. I have pre-built a whole bunch of layout components for you to try out. And so if you want to see how all of these different layouts get created, you can just go to this template and then you can look in the layout and see how they're done, the different spacing, the direction, the alignment. I have simple layouts like this. I have layouts that are more like the common layouts that you might use for a web page. And I have layouts that are more like particular components that you might use. So these are card style layouts, and we also have navigation style layouts here as well. Now, I'm keeping an eye on the time, so I'm going to do a whistle-stop tour through how to choose between flex and grid layouts. If I return back to that original app view that I showed you, now we have a lot of different flex and grid layouts inside of here that I've chosen. And honestly, a lot of the time, the way that I choose whether to use flex and grid is just by trying it out and seeing what works. And I would say, particularly if you're just learning right now, it's the best approach to help you familiarize yourself. You have a specific layout in mind, you know what you want to do, and you need to work out how to get there. Because quite honestly, with a lot of layout, flex and grid kind of can work equally well. Just sometimes you need a little bit more control with wrapping things onto the next line. Sometimes you need a little bit more control that you want to have something positioned very precisely. You want to have that visible grid and row lines. So it really kind of depends in that situation. Honestly, when I'm designing for the web, 99% of the time, I will go for flex. I would say if in doubt, try flex first, because even if you want row and column based layouts, you can see that this is kind of a row based layout here, this genre list, and that's using flex. So even if you want that very clean aligned lines, you can usually do that with flex as well. So I think, did I? Yes. And you can use both together, which of course I have shown you in this layout too already. Next up, we will get to questions, keeping an eye on the time, gonna have some time for it. Let's quickly look again at how to test your flex and grid's responsiveness. I'm jumping back to this little flex layout that we made earlier, and I am going to grab the code for it, because honestly, the best way to test it is to use the code. You don't have to know code to do this, so I would recommend to you that you use CodePen. It's a great tool. Basically what CodePen does is it gives you a web page that exists already, and you just need to paste in the HTML for your design and the CSS. The HTML is what gives it its structure. So your HTML has the content in, it has the text, it has your images, it has your icons and things like that. And then the CSS is what gives it its style. It's what controls the layout, the colors, the fonts that you've chosen to use. So I can just go into my code and I'm grabbing my CSS. That's jumping in there. I'm going to grab my HTML and I'm going to save it. And there we go. So right now I can see my image is very big, but it is very much filling the available space. My text is tiny, but if I, right in that bottom right hand corner, if I resize it to narrow, you can see how this is resizing okay. It is not doing too badly. I'm going to change the layout this way around. And yeah, you can see vertically how it might work as well. Sometimes when you're testing tiny components like this rather than whole page layouts, it can be kind of hard to be like, oh, I don't want it to fill all of that space. That's too much. What if this component is just being used in a page layout? In that case, you might want to add some restrictions in there. So I'm just going to jump back into my layout here. And one of the things that you can do is you can say for this card, I'm going to put it in on another board. So this is my new background. I'm going to call this body just so that we know it's the new background. So I'm going to say, okay, my card, my layout, my flex, this is fitting the content already, but I want it to be, I'm going to give this body a lot more layout to it. So I'm going to make this, is that going to work? No. Oh, that's it. Right. So if I have this, I want the card to be full width and full height, but, and the body has whatever size it is, it doesn't really matter. The card is going to be full width and height, but I want to specify that I have a maximum width and a maximum height. And so what this will do is this will tell your layout, okay, I want it to be full width. I want it to take up all that space, particularly when it's on those very small screens where you want to be able to fit everything in there. But maybe I don't want it to fill the entirety of the screen if someone's looking at it on a desktop. And so I want to add a maximum width of, say, 300 and a maximum height of, say, 400. I got that set correctly. And it's well within that right now, so let me do some different example. 200, there we go. And 360, still within 360, 300. Yeah, and so that will ensure that it doesn't grow any bigger than that. So you sometimes want to keep a constraint on it. I think I need a bit more. Oh, there we go. And we set that to the full width and height again. Fill that space, and because it's gone to fixed width again, make sure that that fits the available space too. If in doubt, make sure you're going through each level and setting the layouts so that it fills the width, so it keeps that flexibility going on. Right. Whew. This has been a lot, so I hope you've got questions for me, and if not, we can do another session later. We can also go into a lot more detail on Flex and Grid. I'd really love to know more about what you want to do with Flex and Grid. What are the knotty issues? Are you struggling with anything? And you can let me know and we can work through it all together. So I'm looking at the first question. Is this in pixels or is rem, m, etc. also available? So right now we have it in pixels. We also, if you're using grid, as I showed you earlier, we also have fractions, and you can use auto, which will flex to the size of the content across the rows and across the columns. We have pixels, and we also have percentages for grids as well, because sometimes that's a lot more easier, flexible element to work towards. In terms of flex, right now it's pixels, but I think this is the way that a lot of people work in the design to development process. You can very easily convert your pixels into M's or Rems, because the difference will always be proportional, and so you might end up having a variable for that. You might end up just removing the pixel unit and replacing it with an M unit. So there are like a lot of ways you can very quickly adapt that. But I mean, if you want M's and Rems support in the future, I would suggest going to the community and letting folks know about that. The Penpot team are really responsive. That was not an intentional pun. So they will certainly consider it if you think that that's a good idea. Or maybe if you are a developer, you want to have a look into the Penpot plugin system that is coming up. Hey, maybe you want to build that into Penpot yourself. Penpot is open source, so contributions are absolutely welcome. Do we have another question? Great. Well, it is hit. We have hit time. That's why no more questions, no more time. And so on that note, I would say sign up for Penpot, give it a go. It is free, so it is very easy for you to jump in and try it. You can work with your team, you've got multiplayer, you can collaborate, you can build flex and grid layouts to your heart's content. If you want access to the file that I've used in this demo here today, As soon as this stream is over, I am jumping into my browser and I'm going to upload it to the community. So go and find the Penpot community. It's linked in the navigation on the Penpot website, and you can get my file from there. You can download it and import it into Penpot yourself. Please give me some feedback. Tell me what you liked and what you want to see in future sessions. I'd really love it. If you just enjoyed it and you don't have much else to say, give me a little like, a little thumbs up. I'd really appreciate it. Lets me know that these sessions are working too. And if you have anything that you want to suggest for future sessions, do let us know. Make sure that you subscribe on the various platforms so that you can be the first to know when there's a new live stream planned. And of course, you can also find out that by following us on all the various social platforms or signing up for Penpot's newsletter. The next session is going to be on the 30th of October, feeling a bit Halloweeny maybe, and we are going to cover another one of my favourite topics, colour palettes and colour libraries. So if you're thinking about getting your design system started, this will be a really great place to start. Thank you so much everyone for joining us. Thank you for your comments, thank you for your questions, I really appreciate it. And I will see you on the 30th of October. Bye bye.